The maintenance hangar at Naval Air Station Oceana sat in darkness, except for a single overhead lamp swinging gently in the salt-heavy breeze that slipped through the open bay doors. Beneath it, an F-35 Sea Lightning II worth $80 million sat grounded, its sleek angular frame casting shadows across oil-stained concrete like a predator frozen mid-strike. 23 technicians had signed off on the aircraft over 6 days. 23 had walked away shaking their heads. The jet's entire electrical system had failed catastrophically during a routine training flight 3 weeks ago, forcing Captain Rebecca Voltage Ortiz to dead-stick the aircraft onto the carrier deck with nothing but hydraulic pressure and pure instinct. The landing had been perfect. The mystery had been absolute. Senior maintenance officers had stripped panels, run diagnostics, replaced modules worth more than most people's houses. Nothing. The F-35's neural network, the integrated core processor system that made the fifth-generation fighter the most advanced aircraft ever built, refused to initialize. Every screen stayed black. Every system stayed silent. Miguel Santos pushed his cleaning cart past the security checkpoint at 200 hours, same as he had every night for 8 months. The night shift guards knew him by sight now. The quiet guy with the engineering degree from Venezuela that nobody in America recognized. The single father who took the night janitor position because it paid $3 more an hour and let him be home when his daughter woke up for school. He wore the same navy blue coveralls as every other facility's maintenance worker, carried the same key card that granted him access to every building on base, and had the same security clearance that got reviewed and approved every 6 months without anyone asking why a man with his credentials was emptying trash cans and mopping floors. The F-35 sat in Bay 7 like a sleeping dragon that had forgotten how to wake. Miguel had been watching it for 6 nights now, had seen the frustration building in the faces of the men and women who worked on it during the day shift. He'd seen them leave behind diagnostic printouts in the trash, had read them while emptying bins, had understood every technical specification and failure code, with the kind of fluency that came from 15 years designing avionics systems in Caracas before the government collapsed, and his expertise became worthless north of the border. Tonight something was different. The hangar was completely empty. The night crew had been called to an emergency on the other side of the base. Miguel stood beside his cart, looking up at the fighter jet, and made a decision that would change everything. He reached into his coverall pocket and pulled out a small toolkit he'd carried every night for 8 months without using. Not yet. Not until now. The F-35's maintenance panel opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing the densest concentration of wiring and circuit boards Miguel had seen since leaving his old life behind. Most people saw chaos here, a nightmare of fiber optics, power conduits, and diagnostic ports that required computer-assisted mapping just to navigate. Miguel saw a language he'd been fluent in since he was 23 years old, back when he'd been leading a team of 12 engineers on a contract for the Venezuelan Air Force, back before his wife died during a routine surgery because the hospital had no electricity, back before he'd taken his 6-year-old daughter's hand and walked across 3 countries to reach a place where she could grow up with a future. His fingers moved with muscle memory that transcended translation, tracing wire bundles with the casual confidence of a concert pianist finding middle C in the dark. The diagnostic reports he'd read had focused on the big systems, the integrated core processor, the distributed aperture system, the advanced electronic warfare suite. They'd replaced components worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd run software patches that required Pentagon authorization. They'd done everything except look at the foundation. Miguel found it in 17 minutes. A single ground wire, 22 gauge, tucked behind a primary power distribution node where it connected to the aircraft's chassis. The connection point showed subtle discoloration, not obvious corrosion, but the telltale signature of a cold solder joint that had cracked during the stress of carrier operations, creating an intermittent fault that would show up as a catastrophic system failure in every diagnostic, but would never register as a simple broken wire because the break was microscopic, invisible except to touch, and because nobody had thought to check something so basic in an aircraft so advanced. He pulled a soldering iron from his toolkit, a nice one, Weller WES-51, bought used from a pawn shop for $40, maintained with the care of someone who understood that tools were the bridge between knowledge and action. The iron heated in 90 seconds. Miguel cleaned the connection point with practiced efficiency, removed the oxidation, reseated the wire, and applied new solder with the kind of precision that came from doing this exact task 10,000 times across a career that officially no longer existed. The repair took 4 minutes. Miguel closed the maintenance panel, returned his tools to his pocket, and went back to his cleaning cart. He pulled out a logbook from the side pocket, the official maintenance log that should have been locked in the crew chief's office, but that someone had carelessly left on a workbench 2 nights ago. Miguel made a single notation in careful print. Reseated chassis ground wire behind primary power distribution node bay 7. Station 23B recommend full electrical recheck before flight certification. He didn't sign it. Instead, he wrote a call sign he'd seen on a helmet sitting on the workbench earlier that evening, belonging to one of the senior maintenance officers. The forgery would hold up to casual inspection. Nobody would question why a lieutenant commander had been working alone at 2 in the morning. They'd just be grateful someone had finally fixed the problem. Miguel finished cleaning the hangar at 4:30, same as always. He clocked out at 4:45, same as always. He drove his 15-year-old Honda Civic across base, housing to the small apartment he shared with his daughter, arriving just as the first light touched the eastern sky. Maria would wake up in 90 minutes. He had time to make her breakfast, pack her lunch, and walk her to the school bus stop before heading to bed for 5 hours of sleep that never felt like enough, but was always better than the alternative. At 800, Chief Warrant Officer Hayes arrived at the hangar with his morning coffee and his daily sense of resignation about the expensive paperweight in Bay 7. He ran through his pre-flight checks with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been disappointed too many times to expect different results. When the F-35 systems initialized on the first attempt, every screen glowing with ready status, every diagnostic showing green across the board, Hayes stared at the display for 30 seconds in absolute silence before reaching for his radio with shaking hands. Captain Rebecca Ortiz received the call while reviewing flight plans in the squadron ready room. She'd been grounded for 3 weeks while her aircraft sat broken, had spent those weeks flying a desk and watching younger pilots take the missions that should have been hers. When Hayes told her the Lightning was ready for functional check flight, she didn't ask questions. She just grabbed her helmet and moved. The pre-flight walk-around revealed nothing unusual. The F-35 looked exactly as it had for 3 weeks, sleek, deadly, and completely inert. But when Ortiz climbed into the cockpit and brought the systems online, the aircraft woke up like it had never been asleep. Every display showed nominal status. Every system responded instantly. The integrated core processor hummed with smooth power, feeding data to her helmet-mounted display, with the seamless integration that made the F-35 feel less like a machine and more like an extension of the pilot's own nervous system. She ran through every check twice, waiting for the failure, expecting the disappointment. Nothing. The jet was perfect. Tower cleared her for a functional check flight, low altitude, local area, full system evaluation. Ortiz taxied to the runway with her heart rate elevated for the first time in weeks, not from fear but from the pure anticipation of being back where she belonged. The takeoff was glass smooth. The F-35 leaped off the runway with 40,000 pounds of thrust, climbing into the morning sky over Virginia Beach with the kind of effortless power that made every other aircraft feel like they were moving through water. Ortiz ran through her test sequence with methodical precision: electrical systems, hydraulics, avionics, weapons integration. Everything performed flawlessly. Whatever had been broken was fixed now, so completely that there was no trace of the failure that had nearly ended her career 3 weeks ago. She keyed her radio. Tower voltage, all systems nominal, requesting clearance for envelope expansion. Her voice was steady, professional, but inside she was grinning like she was 23 again and flying her first solo in the T-45 Goshawk. Back in the hangar, Hayes stood with a maintenance tablet in his hands, reviewing the log entry that someone had made overnight. The handwriting looked like Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's, same precise capital letters, same technical terminology, but Mitchell had been home with his family last night. Hayes had personally sent everyone home at 1800 hours. He checked the security logs. The only person who'd entered Bay 7 after 2200 was Miguel Santos, facilities maintenance. Access logged at 2:03 hours for routine cleaning. Hayes looked at the note again. Receded chassis ground wire behind primary power distribution node Bay 7, station 23B. The location was so specific. The terminology was so precise. He walked to the F-35, opened the maintenance panel, and examined the connection point. The solder joint was fresh, 12 hours old at most, done with professional skill, the kind of work that came from years of experience and steady hands. He closed the panel slowly, thinking. Then he pulled out his phone and opened the base personnel database, typing in Miguel Santos's name. The file showed basic information: hired 8 months ago, facilities maintenance, night shift, security clearance current. But Hayes had been in the Navy for 22 years. He knew how to read between lines. He opened the original employment application, scrolling past the standard information until he found the education section. Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering, Universidad Central de Venezuela. Master of Science in Avionics Systems, same university. 15 years of professional experience listed at companies that no longer existed, in a country that had collapsed into chaos while the world watched. Hayes stood in the empty hangar, holding his phone, understanding blooming like dawn over the ocean. A janitor. They had a master's degree engineer working night shift for $16 an hour because the United States didn't recognize foreign credentials, because starting over meant starting at the bottom, because feeding a daughter mattered more than pride. And that engineer had just fixed an $80 million problem that 23 certified technicians couldn't solve, had done it in the middle of the night without asking for credit or recognition, had forged a log entry to make sure someone else got the glory because getting noticed would raise questions he couldn't afford to answer. Hayes made a decision. He closed the personnel file, deleted his search history, and walked back to his office. The F-35 was fixed. Captain Ortiz was back in the air. That was all that mattered. Some secrets were worth keeping, especially when they belonged to someone who'd already sacrificed more than most people could imagine. 3 miles above the Atlantic, Ortiz pushed the F-35 through a series of high-G turns, feeling the jet respond to her inputs with the precision of a surgical instrument. The aircraft was better than perfect. It was alive again, humming with power and purpose. She climbed to Angels 20, leveled off, and let herself enjoy the pure silence of flight at the edge of space, where the sky turned from blue to black and the curvature of the earth became visible on the horizon. Her radio crackled. "Voltage tower, you're cleared for carrier quals if you want them. USS George Washington is conducting flight ops 40 nautical miles east." Ortiz smiled inside her helmet. 3 weeks ago she'd made an emergency landing that should have been impossible, bringing a dead jet home on nothing but skill and nerve. Today she was going to land on a carrier deck at night, just because she could, just to prove that whatever had tried to ground her had failed. Tower voltage. Request vector to the boat. She banked east, the F-35 carving through the sky like it had been born for this moment. And maybe it had, maybe they both had. the pilot and the machine and the invisible engineer who'd made it possible, all connected by a single wire and the understanding that sometimes the most important work happens in darkness, done by hands that nobody notices, by people who ask for nothing except the chance to be useful. Miguel Santos picked up his daughter from school at 14:30, same as always. Maria came running out of the building with her backpack bouncing and a paper in her hands. A test, math, 98%, she was so proud. He hugged her and told her she was brilliant, told her in Spanish that she could be anything she wanted to be, engineer, doctor, astronaut, anything, because this was America and here your past didn't define your future. They stopped at the park on the way home, same as always. Maria played on the swings while Miguel sat on a bench, watching her laugh in the afternoon sunlight. Above them, so high it was almost invisible, a single contrail drew a white line across the blue sky. Miguel watched it for a moment, recognizing the signature of an F-35 at high altitude by the way the contrail formed and dissipated. He didn't know if it was the same aircraft he'd repaired. It didn't matter. Somewhere up there, someone was flying. Somewhere up there, someone was safe because he'd remembered who he used to be for 4 minutes in the darkness. He looked back at his daughter, at her joy, at her future, and decided that was enough. Some bridges you couldn't rebuild. Some careers couldn't be restarted. But every night he had the chance to be useful, to take knowledge that most people would never see and apply it where it mattered most, in the silence, in the shadows, where the work got done not for glory but because it needed doing. That evening, Admiral Richardson held a briefing in the Carrier Air Wing conference room. The subject was the F-35 Lightning II and its unexpected return to full operational status. Senior maintenance officers presented their findings. A ground wire fault so subtle that standard diagnostics had missed it completely. A repair so simple that it seemed almost embarrassing after 3 weeks of intensive investigation. "Who made the repair?" Richardson asked, looking at the assembled officers. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell started to speak, then stopped. He'd read the log entry with his call sign on it, knew he hadn't written it, knew he'd been home with his family when the repair was made. He looked at Chief Hayes, caught something in the other man's expression that made him choose his words carefully. "The important thing is the aircraft is operational, Admiral. Captain Ortiz completed a full functional check flight this morning. All systems performed flawlessly." Richardson studied him for a moment, then nodded. He'd been in the Navy long enough to know that some questions had answers that were better left unasked. The jet was flying. The pilot was back in rotation. Those were the facts that mattered. But that night, Richardson found himself reviewing the same personnel files that Hayes had examined earlier. He read Miguel Santos's education history, his work experience, his careful progression from respected engineer to invisible janitor. He closed the file and looked out his office window at the flight line, at the rows of aircraft representing billions of dollars of technology and decades of advancement, and thought about the strange mathematics of human value, how a man's expertise could become worthless the moment he crossed a border, how competence became invisible when it wore the wrong uniform. Richardson made 3 phone calls. The first was to the base commander. The second was to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. The third was to the Department of Defense Foreign Credential Recognition Office. The conversations were brief and carefully phrased. Nobody mentioned Miguel Santos by name. They didn't have to. In an organization built on hierarchy and protocol, sometimes the most important communications happened in the spaces between words. 2 weeks later, Miguel received a letter on official Navy letterhead. It informed him that his foreign credentials had been reviewed and recognized under a Department of Defense initiative to identify and utilize specialized expertise among base personnel. The letter offered him a position as a civilian contractor in the Aviation Maintenance Division, starting salary $73,000 annually, with the option to pursue additional certification that would be fully funded by the Navy. Miguel read the letter 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table after dropping Maria at school. He thought about nights in the hangar, about the weight of knowledge that had nowhere to go, about the strange path that had brought him from designing avionics systems in Caracas to mopping floors in Virginia Beach to this moment. This offer, this second chance that most people never received. He called the number on the letter. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Miguel accepted the position, effective immediately. When he hung up, he sat in silence, feeling something he hadn't felt in 8 years, the sensation of moving forward instead of just surviving, of being seen for who he was instead of what circumstances had made him. That afternoon, he picked Maria up from school wearing civilian contractor identification instead of facilities maintenance coveralls. She noticed immediately, asked him what changed, why he looked different. Miguel knelt down to her level and told her in Spanish that sometimes the universe rewarded patience, that sometimes doing good work in darkness eventually brought you back into the light. 3 months later, Captain Rebecca Ortiz stood in front of a hangar full of assembled personnel for what the official schedule called a Maintenance Excellence Recognition Ceremony. She wore her dress uniform, ribbons aligned perfectly, brass polished to mirror brightness. Behind her, the F-35 Lightning II sat in perfect condition, every system optimal, every surface gleaming under the hangar lights. 3 weeks ago, she began, this aircraft experienced a catastrophic electrical failure. I managed to bring it home safely, but it was broken in a way that nobody seemed able to fix. 23 certified technicians tried and failed, and then someone who wasn't supposed to be able to fix it did. She turned and gestured to Miguel Santos, who stood near the back of the assembled crowd wearing contractor coveralls and looking profoundly uncomfortable with the attention. Miguel came to this country with expertise that wasn't recognized, credentials that didn't transfer, and a daughter who needed food and shelter and opportunity. So he took a job as a janitor because it paid $3 more an hour than the alternatives. And he did that job with the same excellence he'd brought to 15 years of engineering work in his home country. Ortiz walked to Miguel, extending her hand. But excellence doesn't stay hidden forever. One night, when nobody was watching, this man used knowledge that officially didn't exist to fix a problem that officially couldn't be solved. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't seek recognition. He just did the work because the work needed doing, because somewhere in his DNA is the understanding that expertise carries responsibility. She handed him a plaque, nothing fancy, just recognition for outstanding technical contribution to naval aviation operations. But behind it was something more valuable, a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, personally signed, acknowledging Miguel's credentials and expertise, creating an official record that could never be taken away, that would follow him through whatever came next in his career. Miguel accepted the plaque with steady hands, but his eyes were wet. He started to speak in careful English, then stopped, took a breath, started again. I just fixed a wire, he said simply. It was a problem I knew how to solve, so I solved it. That is all. But it wasn't all, and everyone in the hangar knew it. It was about competence surviving exile, about expertise refusing to be wasted, about a man who could have been bitter and instead chose to be useful. It was about the strange journey from Caracas to Virginia Beach, from lead engineer to janitor to the thing he should have been all along, someone whose knowledge mattered, whose skills had value, whose presence made impossible things possible. After the ceremony, Ortiz found Miguel near his workstation, organizing tools with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. I never got to thank you properly, she said, for bringing my jet home. Miguel looked at her, then at the F-35 visible through the hangar doors. That aircraft is alive, he said softly. It wants to fly. I just reminded it how. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. And I think maybe it reminded me too, who I used to be, who I can still become. Ortiz nodded, understanding blooming between them without need for additional words. They stood together in comfortable silence, the pilot and the engineer, both experts in systems that operated at the edge of human capability, both intimately familiar with the experience of being underestimated, both proof that competence eventually finds a way to matter regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. Outside, the sun set over Naval Air Station Oshana, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. F-35s launched for evening training sorties, their engines roaring with power that was only possible because thousands of people made thousands of correct decisions every single day. Most of those people would never be recognized. Most of that work would happen in obscurity. But it mattered. Every wire, every connection. Every moment of expertise applied with care and precision in the darkness, building something larger than any individual contribution. Miguel Santos drove home that evening with a plaque on his passenger seat, and a daughter waiting for him who didn't yet understand everything that had changed, but who knew her father was smiling in a way she hadn't seen since before they left Venezuela. He made dinner, arepas, her favorite, and they ate together while Maria told him about her day, about her friends, about the science project she wanted to work on that would definitely win first place. After she went to bed, Miguel stood at his apartment window, looking out at the base in the distance. Somewhere out there, jets were flying. Somewhere out there, pilots were trusting their lives to systems that worked because someone had cared enough to make them work. He thought about the strange mathematics of immigration, how crossing a border could erase expertise but never eliminate it, how credentials might not transfer but knowledge always survived, waiting patiently for the moment when it would matter again. His phone buzzed. A text message from Chief Hayes. Got 3 more birds with electrical gremlins. Report to Bay 12 tomorrow, 600. Bring your good soldering iron. Miguel smiled and replied with a simple affirmative. He wouldn't bring the Weller from the pawn shop. Tomorrow, he'd bring the professional Hacko station the Navy had issued him along with his contractor equipment, along with the diagnostic tools and technical manuals that officially recognized what he'd always been capable of doing. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that hangar not as someone cleaning up after the experts, but as one of the experts himself. Knowledge and credential finally aligned again. He turned off the lights and went to bed, sleeping better than he had in 8 years, dreaming not of the past but of the future, of the jets he'd keep flying, of the daughter he'd raise in a country that finally saw what he'd been trying to show them all along. That expertise doesn't have borders, that competence speaks every language, and that sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one nobody notices, until the moment when everything depends on them being exactly where they are. Knowing exactly what they know, ready to bridge the gap between broken and whole with nothing but steady hands, and the quiet confidence that comes from mastery, earned through decades of dedicated work. Above the base, stars emerged in the darkening sky, ancient light from distant sources finally reaching Earth after journeys measured in years. Miguel Santos had traveled his own distance to arrive at this moment, and the light he carried, knowledge, expertise, competence, had survived the journey intact, waiting patiently through darkness until the moment when it could shine again. That moment had arrived. The work continued. The jets kept flying. And somewhere in the night, a single wire carried current exactly where it needed to go, completing a circuit that connected past to present, exile to homecoming, invisibility to recognition, proving that sometimes the smallest things matter most, that sometimes fixing what's broken starts with seeing what others missed, and that sometimes the person who saves the day is the one who never stopped being qualified, even when the world forgot how to see it.